Today's Hiwatt soundbite is all about details versus emotions and how to produce mixes that make an impact. Well, I am very excited about today's session. I believe one of the most important things that I should be sharing on this channel is sort of identifying and addressing some of the fundamental mistakes that I've made over my career. In one of my more recent sessions called the mute button, I talked about one of these kind of fundamental mistakes where I really wouldn't introduce the lead vocal until at least halfway or better through that mix. In other words, whatever allotted time that I had scheduled for that mix, I would literally spend half of that time mixing that song as an instrumental before even adding the lead vocal. Yeah, I just didn't understand at that time in my career just how major a malfunction that was when trying to mix music to not introduce that lead to so late in the track. I covered it in that mute button session, but literally today, it's just about the opposite. I get to that lead vocal within the first 10 minutes of that mix. So for today's session, I want to share one of these sort of fundamental mistakes that I believe I used to make, and not just kind of identify it, but absolutely address how I moved past this and sort of how I got my head around this. 20 years ago, when I was really all about engineering and mixing, I would get so wrapped up in the details of a mix that I sort of really wouldn't address the big picture of a mix. In other words, I would just go deep into a track and be detailing things like the tone of my hi-hats and, the balance of maybe 3 microphones that make up a guitar sound, or, the tone of a room that's being gated and put on that snare drum. All of those subtle details are absolutely important. I'm not saying for an instant that they're not. But when someone hears a piece of music and it absolutely floors them and they're emotionally charged and it just is oh my goodness, the reason that they're getting that reaction, I can promise you it's not the hi-hat tone, okay? The poor hi-hat track takes a real beating from me when I get into the subject. But in my experience, it's not the tone of that hi-hat that's going to move people when they hear music. It's going to be much bigger picture things like dynamics and building things into that mix that are going to emotionally charge the listener. The first kind of 10 years of mixing, I was really all inside those details way, way too much. It was just preventing me from getting to the real meat and potatoes of what it was that was going to make that track emotionally move someone. That idea of just going so deep into the details that you sort of just forget about the big picture. The way I go about producing and mixing tracks today is so different. I don't spend a lot of time on those details at all. I spend probably 80% of the time that I mix in music today creating dynamics, creating things that happen in a really good and big way. Drawing that listener's focus to one event that happens in that track that might be big and bold and awesome and memorable and drive that listener's emotions, right? The results that I'm getting from this kind of approach, just game-changing in how that track comes across to the listener. Even today, I still find myself sometimes getting wrapped up in these tiny little details and sort of going down the rabbit trail of a particular subtle little effect. Now, I'm sure some of you can relate to this, but most of the music that I've produced over my career has not been about subtlety. It's been about the exact opposite. It's like literally having things sometimes jump out of the speakers and almost assault the listener in a good emotional kind of way. The whole subject is sort of tough to show specific examples. I can go back and listen to the mixes that I was up to 25 years ago, and I can absolutely hear all kinds of really beautiful detail and, all these things going on. The mixes sound good. It's just that a lot of times they're very kind of linear. Not a lot of things going on in the big picture. Tons of detail and subtle little things going on, but not a lot of movement and shape and things, right? I do have a specific example of something that I did as a producer with a band that I was recording once that I went to a lot of trouble to create something that I thought was going to be really cool. Okay, so for this one, I'm taking the clock back again a ways. I'm in Mushroom Studios in Vancouver, BC. recording a band. We had the studio locked out, I think, for a month and a half. They had had a couple of albums that had done pretty well. So, at that point on their third record, I think it was like they started to have some decent budget. That was back in the days when even an indie band could get a real record budget, right? I had the main kind of band all set up in the main room. I had the drum kit kind of in the big corner, and all the rest of the band members were all basically in that same room with the drummer. And we actually didn't use headphones. I set everything up on monitors. It was an awesome session. I remember that very well. Well, one of the ideas that I came up with for this record was this wonderful idea that I thought was like, oh man, this is going to be the end all of this is going to be the thing, man. This is going to be the secret weapon in the studio, okay? I took the trouble to have this drummer rent a second drum kit, really kind of beautiful deluxe drum kit that was actually quite a bit different from his original. In other words, some of the drum sizes were different, and of course, it's a whole different drum manufacturer and stuff. But I had this drummer rent another whole kit, and we set a second drum kit up in what they called the piano room at Mushroom. So I'm talking about a really small, tight room with wood floors, early reflections, a lot of glass in the room. Very different sounding room when you're in that room speaking than when you say walk into the main studio. The main studio had high ceilings, lots of volume in the room, and it sounded like it. When you walked out to that drum kit in that big room and you whacked that snare drum, it was like big. When you went into that little piano room after we set up that drum kit and you whacked the snare drum in there, it was like tight, right in your face, right? Well, I thought, okay, this is going to be epic. We're going to do as many takes as we need to. All of the chorus parts and the bridge come from the main room. And we're going to have all of the verses and the intro and stuff come from this, subtle little tight, punchy little room, right? So you can imagine that's a lot of work. I literally had 2 full drum kits set up and an entire band. Well, I took the time to go through this process, back and forth, different takes, until as the producer, I felt like I had a really good drum take that would work for the whole song from these 2 rooms. Well, then I sent the band home basically after that. I said, you guys take a night off and I'm going to get at this thing and put it together in the way that I know it's just going to be epic, right? Really excited to do this. So I'm literally talking pre-Pro Tools, right? We're in the studio and I'm cutting 2-inch tape. I cut together the bed track of this song using the small room drums for the intro and the verses and cutting hard with a razor blade to the big room for the choruses and the bridge. Well, I can tell you that after going through all of that work, and I'm talking hours of setup, hours, we're talking about 2 totally different drum sounds in 2 totally different rooms. You absolutely could not hear the difference when that edit would go by. In other words, when I put all of that together and I added the rest of the band in, it was so subtle, the difference between these 2 rooms. I was like going, how can this even be? I didn't get it, because out there in the rooms, they sounded so different, these 2 drum kits, right? In the respective rooms. But in pop music, with all of these other things happening, guitars, bass, keyboards, vocals, everything pumping through those speakers, there was absolutely no difference between those 2 drum sounds in the final result. I just think that's a great example, because it's a real example of where I went to a lot of work to create 2 entirely different drum kits, 2 totally different drum sounds, recorded in different rooms, edited together, and I swear you could not hear the difference between the 2. It was just, if you soloed the drums all by themselves, of course you could hear, but even then it was a pretty subtle change. You can spend 3 hours dialing in that perfect hi-hat tone. I would just recommend that instead you spend like 10 minutes working on that hi-hat sound and about 2.5 hours of that time working on the arrangement, working on just how emotionally that song can impact you. Now, this is pretty simple stuff, but it has made a fundamental difference in the results that I get from mixes today and how those mixes impact the listener. I think this simple idea can have a huge influence on how your mixes impact people emotionally.